Today we're going to talk about the difference between a raised bed and an in-ground bed, why you might want to do one or the other, the pros and cons of both. That's coming up next on The Urban Farmer. This is the first raised bed that I've actually ever built on my farm. I've seen raised beds in many different contexts, and there's also different kinds of raised beds. So let's first talk about that. This is a raised bed where I've built it out of a frame. You can build raised beds in a variety of different ways, out of wood, out of concrete, out of bricks, all kinds of different things. You can also hill up raised beds. So if some of you are familiar with the work of Jean-Martin Fortier, he uses a tool called a rotary plow, and he pushes the dirt up from his walkways into the beds and makes a sort of a hilled raised bed. There's a couple of reasons you might want to do a raised bed. One reason, and perhaps the most predominant reason in a gardening context, is because you want it higher off the ground so you don't have to spend your time kneeling down or bending your back. So there's an ergonomic reason for a raised bed. The other reason, there's two other reasons you might want to do a raised bed. One is to get it higher off the ground to keep it warmer, so the soil warms up faster in the spring. And the other reason you might do a raised bed is to get it higher off the ground so it drains better. In areas where you have high amounts of precipitation, raised beds are quite practical. So in the case of Jean-Martin Fortier's farm, all of their beds are raised up because in southern Quebec, they get a lot of rainfall, and they get so much in their growing season that they barely need to run sprinkler systems and irrigation. So this allows them to keep the water off their crop, gives them some amount of drainage, and allows them to grow better crops. So it's important to understand the context in that point, that makes sense for the area that they're living in. The area that I live in is a different context, and when we go outside and look at my in-ground beds, I'll explain that. But some of the cons with a raised bed, if you're building a raised bed such as this, that's a big cost, right? I built this bed here because it's in my permanent greenhouse that has a concrete foundation, and I want to be able to grow a lot of stuff in here all winter long. So it makes sense. It makes sense for the design of my greenhouse, which isn't entirely finished either. But it's a context thing. Other raised beds, you might have costs. Think about the raised beds in Cuba where they're using cinder block type things. It makes sense. It has a practical application, but there is a cost there. And there's also there's a cost in the labors, and you have to go and build these beds. A disadvantage to a raised bed in this kind of context is that it's harder to get machinery in and out of. So you're more or less having to use hand equipment and just simple manual tools to manage it. You can't run a rototiller through here, though there are some raised beds out in fields where you could, but it does make things a little bit more challenging. So again, it's all about the context of what makes sense for your operation. Let's go look at my in-ground beds so you can be able to understand why I use that in my context. So for those of you who are familiar with my work, you know that I do all of my beds in the ground. They're not hilled up, they're not raised in any way. There's really two reasons for that. The first and most important reason is I live in a high desert. I live in a desert climate that's high elevation, and we get very hot and dry summers. Right now it's been a bit precipitous, which is typical for the fall. But for the most part, we live in a very dry area, and a raised bed doesn't give me any advantage because when I raise my beds up, that means that the sides will dry out a lot quicker. I'm not looking for a way to shed water and get water off my crops. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. I want more water on my crops if I can. So my beds are flush with my walkways. They're not raised up in any way. The second reason is cost. I don't own most of the land that I'm farming on. In fact, this yard, which is just next door to my place, I lease out from my neighbors, which is how I farm most of my land. So I'm not going to come in and spend money to build some kind of raised bed. So there's the cost there. So it's essentially it's practical because I can come in, rip up the land, and get it into production really quickly. There's no advantage for me having a raised bed. If I was living in a climate like Jean Martin's in Quebec, I would use a tool like a rotary plow, and I would do what he does, is I would hill up my raised beds. But you have to understand that it's all about context here. So for me, it's really about cost and the fact that I'm in a dry climate and I don't need to have a raised bed. So that's my answer to raised beds or in-ground beds. This has come up a lot. I've seen a lot of questions in the comments there, and so I decided to address it. If you guys have any more questions or comments, please leave them below. And if you want to see more stuff like this, please hit the subscribe button right now. Like and share these videos with your friends, and check out my online course, profitableurbanfarming.com, and my book and one-day workshop and other stuff like that you can find at my website at theurbanfarmer.co. And if you'd like to make a donation to the show, it's much appreciated and always welcome. It allows me to continue making this content and taking the time for you guys to make it. So if you can afford it, it does help a lot. You can do that at theurbanfarmer.co/support. All right, thanks for watching.